Welcome back. This is It's About Time. Let's get right to it.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we're diving into something that, honestly, most people don't think too much about.
Right.
It's Florida's life without parole population, or LWOP.
Yeah.
We'll be taking excerpts from a brand new book called Life Ain't Fair.
Okay.
To understand just how Florida became the world leader in LWOP sentences.
Wow. World leader, huh?
Yeah, world leader, and of course what that means for you, the taxpayer.
Right.
But before we get into all that,
Yeah.
I gotta hit you with a fact that'll make you raise an eyebrow.
Okay, I'm ready.
Florida has more LWOP inmates than California, New York, and Texas
Really?
combined.
Wow.
That's right. A state a fraction of the size is way more people locked away forever.
That's crazy.
It is crazy. So buckle up. This deep dive is going to be eye-opening.
I can't wait.
Okay, so jumping right in.
Yeah.
The sheer scale of Florida's LWOP population is pretty mind-blowing.
It is. And what's interesting is this wasn't always the case.
Yeah, right.
Back in the 70s and 80s, Florida's approach to crime was actually pretty lenient.
Yeah.
Like the average time served on a life sentence was less than 6 years.
Wow.
But then the tough on crime movement hit in the 90s, and Florida just went all in.
Yeah, the book really captures that shift.
Yeah.
It even tells this story about an older inmate who mentored the author.
Oh, wow.
This guy was super knowledgeable, clearly had so much potential, but there he was serving LWOP.
Right.
It really makes you think about how many others are in the same boat,
Yeah, stuck in a system that isn't really helping anyone.
especially not the taxpayer.
Exactly. And that anecdote is so powerful because it shows the human cost of these policies.
Right.
This shift to extreme sentencing has had huge consequences,
Yeah.
Like since the 80s, Florida's prison population has exploded by over 400%.
400%.
That's a massive increase.
It is, especially considering that crime rates nationwide have actually been dropping.
Yeah, and this trend is the same in states with very different sentencing policies. It raises the question, is Florida's approach really making us safer?
Or are we just spending a fortune and creating more problems?
Exactly.
Well, let's talk about the elephant in the room then, the cost.
Yeah.
The book says it costs Florida taxpayers at least $1 million to keep just one LWOP inmate incarcerated.
$1 million.
$1 million per person for the rest of their lives.
Wow.
And with Florida's huge LWOP population, we're talking over $334 million annually.
Just to keep these people locked up.
That's right. So think about it. If someone handed you $1 million,
Okay.
did you choose to lock someone away forever?
I don't know.
Because that's basically what's happening with our tax dollars right now.
It's a tough question.
And you know what else is interesting?
What's that?
This image we have of LWOP inmates being the worst of the worst
Yeah.
doesn't always line up with reality.
Really?
Studies of those Florida Department of Corrections disciplinary records
Okay.
show that over half of LWOP inmates don't actually pose a significant threat.
So they're not causing trouble,
Nope, they're not considered a danger to others.
but they're still there.
They're just there.
That's interesting.
And here's another thing that might surprise you.
Okay, hey, May.
Research shows that people serving life sentences when they're released are actually less likely to commit new crimes
Wait, what?
compared to other inmates.
Huh.
One study even found the recidivism rate is less than 1/3 of other inmates.
That's pretty surprising.
It challenges that whole assumption that these people are inherently dangerous.
Right. And that they can't be rehabilitated.
Exactly.
There's a story in the book, actually, about the author's cellmate
Okay.
who got his charge overturned on a technicality.
Oh, wow.
The author had even defended this guy in a fight, but they ended up with completely different outcomes.
Despite being in similar situations.
Exactly. It just shows how random the system can be sometimes.
It really does. So I got to ask, what are your initial thoughts on all this? Knowing that Florida has more people serving life without parole than any other state.
It definitely makes you question how we got here.
It does.
And it raises some big questions about our priorities as a society.
Like what?
Are we really focused on public safety and rehabilitation, or are we just reacting out of fear?
Reacting out of fear and resorting to punishment as the default.
Exactly.
And speaking of reactions,
Yeah.
the racial disparities in Florida's LWOP population are pretty stark.
Yeah, absolutely. The book talks about how 66% of young adults and 51% of the overall LWOP population in Florida are Black.
Wow.
It's a huge number. And it forces us to look at the history of Florida's prison system.
Yeah, and when we do that, we see some disturbing parallels between the past and the present.
Like, what are you thinking of?
Things like convict leasing and chain gangs,
Right.
How the exploitation of black labor back then seems to have morphed into this modern-day prison industrial complex.
That profits from mass incarceration.
Exactly. It's like history repeating itself, but in a new form.
Yeah, and the book has specific examples like Keefe Commissary Network.
Yeah.
They have this contract with the Florida Department of Corrections where they pay a fee per inmate per day.
Regardless of sales.
Exactly. And they're allowed to charge inflated prices for basic stuff.
So taxpayers are paying to incarcerate these people.
Yeah.
And then their families are being exploited through these overpriced commissary items.
It's a double whammy.
It is. And then there's the whole issue with phone services.
Right.
The book mentions how those services are often manipulated to make a profit.
Yeah.
Making it ridiculously expensive for families to stay connected.
It's adding another layer of hardship to an already difficult situation.
Right. And it makes you wonder, is this system really about justice?
Or is it just another way to exploit vulnerable communities for money?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is, and it gets even harder to answer when you think about the human impact of all this.
Yeah.
The book shares this really sad story about the author learning about his friend's death while he was incarcerated. It really hits home the emotional toll that LWOP takes on everyone involved.
It's a reminder that we're talking about real people here, not just numbers.
Exactly.
Speaking of tough realities, let's talk about this idea of death by incarceration.
Oh, yeah.
It's basically saying that LWOP is just a slower version of the death penalty.
Right.
These people are being denied any chance of release.
Regardless of how much they've changed or if they've actually rehabilitated.
Exactly. It's a powerful way to look at it because it forces us to face the finality of these sentences.
And Florida has the highest rate of overturned death penalty cases in the U.S.
Around 30%.
It makes you wonder how many LWOP sentences might also be flawed.
If they got the same level of scrutiny.
Right.
It's a lot to think about, but thankfully, Life Ain't Fair doesn't just point out all these problems.
Without offering solutions.
Yeah, it actually gives some pretty compelling ideas for how Florida could reform its justice system.
Like what?
Starting with a shift away from punishment.
Towards a more restorative approach. One of the key ideas in the book is restitution.
Okay.
It argues that the current system often puts the state's interest above the victims, and that restitution could be a better way to hold offenders accountable and actually make things right.
So instead of just focusing on punishing the offender, we'd focus on repairing the harm they caused.
And making the victim whole again.
Okay, yeah.
The book uses a good analogy to show how the state's interest can overshadow the victims.
What's that?
Imagine a mediator who's supposed to help two people reach a fair agreement.
Okay.
But instead, they start taking a cut of the money.
Oh.
That's kind of what's happening in our system.
The state's acting as a mediator, but they're also benefiting from the punishment.
Exactly.
I see how that could lead to a system that puts punishment over actual justice for the victim.
And that's where the book's proposed solutions come in.
Okay, so tell me more.
Well, it suggests a whole range of reforms, from creating special units to review cases of rehabilitated LWOP inmates, to developing programs that assess and prepare people for release.
And these programs would use those evidence-based risk assessment tools to figure out how likely someone is to reoffend.
Exactly. It's about being more data-driven.
And they'd involve different people, like law students.
Right. They'd get experience while ensuring thorough evaluations.
That's a great idea.
And the book also talks about the need for second chance communities.
Okay, what are those?
They'd help people reintegrate into society after being released.
So things like housing and job training.
Yeah, and counseling and mentoring.
Basically a support system to help them succeed.
And avoid ending up back in prison.
It makes sense. You can't just release someone after decades and expect them to be fine.
Right, they need support.
All of this could also save taxpayers a lot of money, too.
Oh, absolutely.
How much are we talking?
The book says releasing even a third of Florida's LWOP population under supervision could save $329 million a year.
Wow.
And housing them in programs like halfway houses could save another $168 million.
That's incredible. But beyond the money, the book also highlights the potential of these individuals.
Yeah, they call it second chance hidden capital.
What do they mean by that?
I think it means these people, despite their past mistakes, have a lot to offer.
Like what?
They could mentor at-risk youth,
Okay.
participate in victim impact programs, even become leaders and activists.
They could work, pay taxes, contribute to society.
Exactly. It's about seeing them as assets, not burdens.
I like that. And the book even tells a hopeful story about an inmate who finds peace in nature and dreams of a future outside prison.
It's a reminder that even in the toughest places, there's potential for change and growth.
So you say there's hope,
I think there's always hope.
but it requires us to be open to new ways of thinking
And to challenge our assumptions.
and to believe in the possibility of redemption.
Exactly. Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about needing a more hopeful approach to Florida's LWOP situation.
Right.
So let's look at some real examples,
Yeah.
starting with this Emerging Adult Parole Opportunity Act. The book highlights it as a model for reform.
Okay.
This act focuses on people who got LWP sentences for crimes they committed when they were under 21. It gives them a chance at parole.
You know, we hear a lot about how young people's brains aren't fully developed until like their mid-20s.
Right.
To lock someone up for life without any chance of parole, especially when they were so young, just seems harsh.
It does. And this act recognizes that young people, even those who've committed serious crimes, have a greater capacity for rehab and change as they mature.
Right.
Don't you think they deserve a chance to show that change?
Yeah, I think it makes sense.
Yeah.
We know young people are more impulsive, more susceptible to peer pressure,
Right.
and the research backs this up.
Uh-huh.
Studies have shown recidivism rates, you know, the chance of someone committing another crime,
Right.
those rates go down as people get older.
Yeah, even for those who've served long sentences.
Exactly. So maybe it's not about being lenient.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that potential for change.
And making decisions that actually keep people safe.
That's a good point. It's about being smart on crime, not just tough on crime.
Exactly.
And Life Ain't Fair talks about other interesting policy changes.
Yeah, like what?
There's one that caught my eye.
Okay.
It's called the REAP Act.
REAP Act.
It stands for Rehabilitation, Evaluation, and Assessment Protocol.
What's that one about?
Well, it's about bringing some consistency and objectivity to evaluating rehabilitation in Florida.
Okay.
Because right now, there's no standard way to assess if an inmate has actually rehabilitated.
Right.
So the REAP Act would create a clear process.
Uh-huh. With criteria.
Yeah, making sure that any decisions about release are based on evidence.
Not just opinions.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
It's like creating a level playing field.
And using data to make decisions.
I like that, and I think the book also mentioned this Florida Corrections Rehabilitative Program Evaluation Committee Act.
Oh, yeah. What about that one?
What's the point of that?
Well, it's all about taking a hard look at how effective the rehab programs in Florida's prisons actually are.
Okay.
The book even points out some promising ones.
Like what?
Things like the Jack Brewer Heroes Second Chance Fatherhood Initiative, the Regina B. Schern and FIU Lifers program,
Okay.
and the GEO and FAU Civics Enrichment Education program.
Wow, those are quite a mouthful.
They are, but these programs aim to give inmates skills and support.
To help them succeed after release.
Right.
So it's not that there aren't any rehab efforts.
Yeah.
It's more about making sure they're working.
And that we're putting money into programs that get results.
Gotcha. So is that what the Life Without Parole Reform Evaluation Committee Act is for?
Evaluating these programs.
Is that it?
Not quite. This one's about creating a committee to look at the big picture of LWOP in Florida.
Okay.
They look at the costs, the impact on recidivism rates, and whether these sentences are actually doing what they're supposed to.
They're tackling the big questions.
Yeah, like, are these sentences making us safer?
Are they worth the money?
Are there better options?
That's a big job.
It is, but it seems like it's what we need.
A thorough and objective review of the whole system.
Exactly, because if we're going to talk about reform,
Yeah.
it needs to be based on facts, not just fear.
You're saying we shouldn't define a person by their risk act.
Exactly, and if we don't give second chances, then we're giving up on those people and on a more just and compassionate society.
It's easy to get caught up in anger, wanting revenge.
It is.
But I think you're right. If we want a truly just and humane society,
Yeah.
we got to believe in second chances,
And we need a system that supports rehab and reintegration.
not just punishment.
Exactly.
That's a really important point.
And Life Ain't Fair isn't just about changing laws,
It's about changing how we think.
being open to the idea of transformation.
This deep dive has really made me think differently about LWOP
Me too.
and about how complicated the justice system is.
Yeah, it's not just about numbers and policies.
It's about people's lives
And the choices we make as a society.
And those choices have a ripple effect.
They impact not just the people in prison, but their families, their communities, all of us.
Okay, let's take another pause here.
All right.
Let everyone absorb all of this.
Sounds good.
When we come back, we'll wrap up this deep dive
Okay.
with some final thoughts from Life Ain't Fair.
And some questions for everyone to think about.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into Florida's LWOP population.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
It really has. We started out looking at how Florida got to be the world leader in those LWOP sentences.
Right.
Explored those policies that got us here. And we talked about that huge cost to taxpayers.
And we got into the realities of life inside for these folks.
Right, challenging that worst of the worst image.
And all that potential for rehab.
Yeah, and we talked about some of the solutions from Life Ain't Fair.
Like those second chance units and dorms.
Right, and community.
Call that a more just system.
But what really hit me about this book is how it makes us rethink the whole purpose of our justice system.
It does.
Like, is it all about punishment and revenge? Just locking people up and throwing away the key?
Right.
Or is it about something bigger?
Like rehab and making things right, giving people a second chance.
Tough questions, but important ones.
Absolutely ones we need to be asking.
Because honestly, the current system isn't working.
Not really.
We're spending billions to keep people locked up.
Often for stuff that's not even violent.
Yeah, and we don't see a return on that.
We might even be making things worse.
Creating more poverty trauma.
And people ending up back in prison.
So what's the alternative?
Well, Life Ain't Fair says it starts with changing how we think,
Okay.
being willing to believe in redemption,
Believing that people can change,
learn from what they did,
contribute to society.
if they get the chance,
It's about seeing everyone as human
no matter their past.
and realizing everyone deserves a second chance.
Not just for them, but for our communities too.
Makes us safer.
A more just society for all of us.
But I bet some people disagree.
Oh yeah.
People who think some crimes are unforgivable.
Right, and some people are beyond saving.
What do you say to them?
I get it, some crimes make you really angry.
Right.
Wanting revenge is natural.
Yeah.
Think about this is true justice about getting even.
Or is it about accountability?
Healing and creating a better future.
That's a big question.
It gets to the core of what kind of society we want,
One based on fear and anger.
or one with compassion and forgiveness.
The choice is ours.
It is, and I think Florida could really lead the way here.
Creating a justice system that's actually just
Fiscally responsible.
focused on giving people a chance.
It's about going beyond tough on crime,
Being smarter.
prioritizing safety and well-being for all,
And it starts with each of us.
educating ourselves, talking about it,
Demanding change.
creating a system that reflects our values.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes.
Mine too.
We learned a lot about LWOP in Florida.
The justice system and how much it needs to change.
But this isn't the end.
No, keep learning.
Read Life Ain't Fair.
Do your own research.
Keep thinking about this.
Challenge what you think you know,
Consider everyone's perspective.
because we all have a part to play in this.
Shaping our justice system and our society.
Let's keep talking about it.
Working together to make things better.
Never giving up on second chances.
Beautifully said. Well, that wraps up our deep dive.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening.
This is It's About Time.